Good morning, my friends, and welcome to yet another spectacular installment of Weekend Update. From very high above all the puerile and vacuous forms of Wyoming mainstream media, this is Cowboy State Politics. I, of course, am your illustrious host, David Iverson, firmly ensconced behind the silver Cowboy State Politics microphone and broadcasting to you from the base of the Bighorns at the Cowboy State Politics studio in Sheridan, Wyoming. Good morning, my friends, and welcome to the program. The last weekend update before I descend into the middle swamp. The 2024 legislative session begins on Monday. This time around, it's what Article 3, Section 6 of our Constitution calls a budget session. The Constitution really doesn't say that much about it, except that, quote, the legislature may meet on even-numbered years for a budget session. During the budget session, no bills except the budget bill may be introduced unless placed on a call by two-thirds vote of either house. If it's not the budget, HB 1, then it requires a supermajority vote. So you would think that that would be the very first bill that's brought up in the legislative session. Not this year. They're not going to be talking about that monstrosity until Thursday. Instead, the House of Representatives is going to be dealing with what they call a consent list. A consent list is a list of bills that are voted on as a package. Typically, these are the ones that are not likely to have all that much controversy surrounding them. And so everybody's kind of in general agreement, yes, we need all of these bills, and we'll vote on them all at once. Using this procedure, any one member can pull any bill from the consent list so that it's voted on its merits alone. The idea being, let's get all these bills out of the way so that we can deal with the ones that are going to require a bunch of debate. Given who's in charge of the House of Representatives, Redcoat Albert Sommers, you can imagine that there are several bills on his consent list that, let's just say, he's trying to sneak by. One of those that he's trying to sneak by on Consent List B, which is on the legislative website, is none other than House Bill 19, the Speaker's so-called Education Savings Account bill. As if any self-respecting conservative is going to let that disaster sit on a consent list. My guess is that's not going to happen. Representative Rep Jennings discussed House Bill 19, Education Savings Accounts, in his hilarious op-ed that was recently published just about all across the state of Wyoming, the Pravda on the Platte, the Cow Pie, and of course, the Independence Network. In it, he said, quote, in their numerous political missives about the matter, and of course he's referring to House Bill 19, our normally less than conservative colleagues forgot to mention Article 3, Section 36, that no appropriation shall be made for charitable, industrial, educational, or benevolent purposes to any person, corporation, or community not under the absolute control of the state. In other words, if your family took ESA money for your children, it would be no different than if they attended the public school you are trying to get them away from. Absolute control means absolute control. It's no small wonder why the Buffalo Bulletin said this bill would, quote, protect the integrity of the public education system. Their conservative bill would be no different than the current public education system, end quote. Comrade David Northrup, or should I say Representative David Northrup, and I'll tell you why I call him comrade in just a second, has taken a little bit of umbrage with Representative Jennings' benevolent lessons in how to actually be a conservative legislator, something that David Northrup knows absolutely nothing about. To understand who this guy is, we have to get in the Wayback Machine and go all the way back to Senate File 104. That's the infamous bill that was struck down by the Wyoming Supreme Court that tried to take all of the power away from our Superintendent of Public Instruction. At that time, the Superintendent of Public Instruction was Cindy Hill. This is a gag that the Redcoats have used a couple of different times. For example, our state auditor doesn't audit anything. In the 2022 budget session, Bob Nicholas tried to take all investment authority away from our state treasurer, And most recently, Nancy Case has tried to strip the Secretary of State of all election duties. So this is something that David Northrup and his pals have repeatedly tried to do to our elected officials. Unlike David Northrup, I actually do my research. I'll get to that in just a second. Now, he didn't actually sponsor or co-sponsor Senate File 104, but sources have told Cowboy State Politics that even though he didn't sponsor it, he was involved in the bill's passage. On paper, at least, it only shows that he voted for it. But there's a little more inside baseball about David Northrup that you need to know about. There's an op-ed published in the Powell Tribune on June 7th of 2022, and it says, and I quote, "The infamous Senate File 104 vote. In 2013, he, David Northrup, voted to strip the superintendent of public instruction of all duties except 5, then appointed a former senator from Arizona who happened to be an Arizona neighbor of a Wyoming senator who was on the Joint Education Committee, the committee that David Northrup was on. When Republicans in Park County called out our elected to answer for Senate File 104, David Northrup put his tail between his legs and did whatever his Wyoming senator told him to do or not do. Yet, in 2022, he put his name in for consideration for a vacancy in the position, didn't get selected, and then sued the state of Wyoming, the state GOP chairman, and the Central Committee 2 days later. In 2019, he was exposed for being in favor of radical gun control, specifically 3-day waiting periods for gun purchases. His response was that he was naive about such matters. In his last year in office, 2020, he got a 30% Republican vote from WyoRhino. He scored lower than most of the Democrats, and yet he claims to be a Reagan Era Republican. I'll tell you more about David Northrup in just a second. But first, an absolutely outrageous profit timeout. Cowboy State Politics is brought to you by Morton Buildings. Have you been thinking about a building for your property? Maybe a shed or a garage or barn or maybe something bigger like a roping arena or a giant warehouse. It doesn't really matter what it is. The first call you should make is to Nick and Jesse at Morton Buildings. Their phone number is 307-674-2532. They are absolutely the experts in metal building construction. You've probably seen their work traveling the highways and byways of Wyoming and not even known it, because their work stands the test of time. You'll receive a 50-year warranty on the foundation, which is something that you're not going to get from any of their competitors. One cool thing that they do is they pour concrete pillars and then insert a steel beam inside them and then set the foundation on top of that. That way, there is no possibility of water getting underneath your foundation and ruining your building. To get the process started, give Nick and Jesse a call at 307-674-2532. Tell them what you've got in mind, and they'll handle all the details. Or you could go to mortonbuildings.com. Winter has finally hit us. At least up here in northern Wyoming it has. And one of the things you're probably not thinking about is your camper. But you really should be. It's the perfect time to get everything fixed so that you're ready for your first outdoor adventure whenever spring finally hits us. Young's Camper Repair over in Worland are the people that you need to call. Tim and Tammy Young can pretty much handle any camper problem. And here's the cool thing about it. If it's way too inconvenient for you to haul your camper all the way to Worland, they'll come to you. So whatever camper problem that you've been dealing with, give Tim and Tammy Young a call at 307-431-8110. Or you can send them an email at youngscamperrepair@gmail.com. Check out their website, youngscamperrepair.com. Whatever your camper repair needs are, give them a call. Again, that phone number is 307-431-8110. The following advertisement has been paid for by Reed Reisner for Senate.
Who's the leader for the Senate? It's Reed Reisner. He's the one for you and me. Cheer his name so happily. R-A-S-N-E-R. What's his name? Reed Reisner. R-A-S-N-E-R. What's his name? Reed Reisner. Reed Reisner for the Senate with the voice so strong and true. Bringing change term limits to Reed Reisner's here for you. R-A-S-N-E-R. What's his name? Reed Reisner.
And now, back to the program. David Northrup isn't anywhere close to being a conservative, nor is he anywhere close to what he calls himself, a Reagan Era Republican. According to WyoVote, David Northrup ranks 73rd on the list of conservative legislators. To give you a bit of comparison, Redcoat Albert Sommers is number 65. David Northrup scored a whopping 40% from the Institute for Legislative Analysis. Most of the guys that did all of that analysis used to work at CPAC. And to give you a bit of comparison, on their list, Nancy Case is more conservative than David Northrup. That's an achievement all on its own. The guy that has attempted to pass Medicaid expansion 13 times is more conservative than you are, sir. Back to a little Wyoming analysis for a bit. According to WyoRhino, David Northrup scored a whopping 20%. And a little comparison, if you don't mind. The lady that wanted to tax you for every mile that you drive and put a little device in your car to track it, Sandy Newsom, she scored a 25%, according to WyoRhino. According to this list, Sandy Newsom is more conservative than David Northrup. And then there's Evidence-Based Wyoming, the site that only shows you how often somebody votes with the Republicans versus how often they vote with the Democrats. According to Evidence-Based Wyoming, David Northrup votes with the Democrats 82.35% of the time. Remember what I always tell you. If it walks like a Democrat, talks like a Democrat, smells like a Democrat, and votes like a Democrat, it's a Democrat. And David Northrup is just a Democrat that can't spell. Now back to his op-ed for a moment. He attempts to paint Representative Mark Jennings as a hypocrite, saying, and I quote, "In the 2023 legislative session, Representative Jennings co-sponsored two different bills, Senate File 143, the Wyoming Freedom Scholarship Act 2, and House Bill 194, the Wyoming Freedom Scholarship Act." Now here's the important part, quote, "But despite his previous yes votes, he now calls both of these bills unconstitutional. That's the definition of hypocrisy, although this is no surprise coming from a member of the Freedom Caucus." End quote. Now, obviously, in writing this dumb op-ed, David Northrup went to wyoledge.gov to find out if Representative Jennings sponsored those two bills, and indeed he did. He no doubt also noticed that at no time did Representative Jennings even have the chance to vote on either of those two bills. Neither of them were introduced to the floor. And as David Northrup knows, being the chairman of the Education Committee, Mark Jennings isn't on it. And it didn't pass David Northrup's committee. So please tell me, Representative Northrup, what do you call intentionally misrepresenting the facts in a published op-ed piece? I'll tell you what I call it. Libel. Or in common everyday parlance, lying. Had Representative Northrup taken the time to ask any of the numerous co-sponsors of House Bill 194, he would know that the intent was to fix whatever inadequacies House Bill 194 had on the floor. But just like checking your facts before you print them in Wyoming's largest news source, the Cow Pie, David Northrup didn't do any of that either. Although, how did he put it? This is no surprise coming from a member of the Wyoming caucus. Secondly, David Northrup claims in his op-ed that House Bill 19 is not going to create state-sponsored preschool. So let me get this straight. If you can't give any money to sectarian organizations, that's what the Wyoming Constitution calls any religious organization, and you can only give that money to secular organizations for the use of preschool, would that not create secular preschools? Just listen to what he wrote. Quote, "And to counter what Representative Jennings and others in the Freedom Caucus would have you believe, House Bill 19 does not create state-sponsored preschools, but instead provides some state funding to low-income parents to put their child in a preschool and K-12 private school of their choice." End quote. Let me just see if I've got my head around this. House Bill 19 is going to give money for preschool education that can't be given to a religious preschool. How is that not creating state-sponsored preschools? Which, by the way, has been on the progressive wish list since as long as I have been studying politics, which has been a very long time. And one last point before I let you go for this morning. As I mentioned earlier, Representative Jennings pointed out that no money can be given out anywhere unless it is under the absolute control of the state. Here's what David Northrup says, quote, "However, the Wyoming Constitution also states in Article 16, Section 6, there's an exception for supporting the poor. The courts have allowed broad interpretation of the term necessary support of the poor, and House Bill 19 would allow all Wyoming families at or below 2.5 times the federal poverty level, an income of $78,000 for a family of 4 to be eligible for these funds." End quote. First, if you're bringing in $78,000 a year into your house, you're not poor. Second, and probably more importantly, you don't get to pick and choose which parts of the Constitution you're going to follow. It's an all-or-nothing deal, Dave. Allow me to put this into terms that you might understand, Representative, since obviously you have a problem reading the legislative website and apparently the Wyoming Constitution. It's okay. I understand. Or, as Representative Henderson would say,
English is a pesky language.
And apparently, the Constitution is a pesky little book. Just because you think you're helping the poor, which, again, if you're making $78,000 a year, you're not poor, that doesn't get you out of whatever money being under the absolute control of the state. The two passages work together, just like the entire Constitution. Given everything that we've talked about this morning, if David Northrup is looking for the hypocrisy that he accuses Representative Jennings of, he need only look in the mirror. There's enough hypocrisy there to cover 10 of these programs. Well, that'll about do it for today's installment of the program. Have a good rest of your weekend. Monday, I'll be coming to you from the depths of the Middle Swamp in our state's capital of Cheyenne. Don't forget to subscribe and follow the program. That way you can be notified every single time there's a brand new episode of Cowboy State Politics. You can do that from the website, cowboystatepolitics.com, or anywhere that you get your podcasts. Also, if you want a bit of a change from all of the politics, you should really check out the lovely Christine's The Hair Affair with Christine. She'll have a new episode out tomorrow. To listen to her program, go to her website, thehairaffairwithchristine.com. It's an interesting program, and it'll make her happy if you do. For now, from the base of the Bighorns at the Cowboy State Politics Studio, I'm David Iverson, and this is the one and only Cowboy State Politics.